Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air. Our program is presented by members and friends of Aware, a local peace group. Aware is an acronym for Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. I'm Carl Estabrook. Aware was established 13 years ago after the 9/11 attacks by citizens of Champaign-Urbana who realized that the U.S. government would use those crimes to justify its already long-standing attempts to exercise military control over the Middle East. Mideast gas and oil are needed by America's economic competitors in Europe and Asia, and control of them gives the U.S. an advantage over China, Germany, and other countries, including Russia. The U.S. invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq and the ongoing American wars throughout the region are not a matter of fighting terrorism. They're about imperial control, just like the invasions by Germany and Japan at the beginning of World War II. Germany said it was stopping Polish terrorism against German citizens, and Japan said it was stopping Chinese bandits. Today, President Obama is bombing Iraq and Syria, and he continues to send drones to kill people in Southwest Asia and East Africa. Obama is the fourth president in a row to bomb Iraq. He's now bombed more countries, 8, than George Bush did, so only 6. It's hard to understand how the president who came into office promising hope and change is hated around the world, but it's obvious from the effects of America's wars. Obama's killing is called fighting terrorism because terrorism is the name the U.S. gives to the armed resistance, which of course can be vicious and brutal, to the generations-long U.S. invasion of the region. Ashton Carter, Obama's new Secretary of Defense, is an advocate for U.S. military attacks on the entire axis of evil, Iraq, North Korea, and Iran. He is a fan of blowing things up, as one of his critics says. The new defense secretary was in fact in favor of restarting the Korean War in disputes with North Korea a few years ago. He is for committing, in other words, what the Nuremberg Tribunal called the supreme international crime, launching aggressive war. After the Nuremberg trials, we executed Nazis for that, but Carter will probably escape hanging, as Hamlet says, because his superior, President Obama, has already committed the supreme international crime several times over. Not only is he the fourth president in a row to bomb Iraq, he has also bombed a half dozen other Middle Eastern countries. And for the time he ran for the Senate, Obama has supported the possibility of a preemptive attack on Iran. In 2004, the Chicago Tribune wrote, quote, "The United States should not rule out military strikes to destroy nuclear production sites in Iran," Obama said. "Having a radical Muslim theocracy in possession of nuclear weapons is worse than us launching some missile strikes into Iran," close quote, Barack Obama. The problem now is that U.S. power in the Middle East relies on an alliance with Saudi Arabia and Israel, both rivals of Iran. But the Obama administration would like to reestablish its alliance with Iran, an alliance which was effective from the U.S. overthrow of an elected government in that country in 1953 to the overthrow of the U.S. puppet government in 1979. After vowing to end combat missions in Afghanistan, Obama has now secretly extended America's longest war. Most Americans believe that the U.S. is withdrawing from Afghanistan, but that's not true. The Obama administration lies about what it's really doing in the Middle East and how they're trying to end the wars. The media, owned by big business, help them to mislead the only enemy that the U.S. government really fears, the American public, who made the government end a similar war in Vietnam 2 generations ago. We'll try to give a better account of what's going on in the Mideast wars tonight, and we will begin with a commentary from Ron Zoke, Dissidence and Denialism.
These are 2 big themes, too big to say much about in the time available today, but I'll simply suggest some reasons why I'm interested in these topics. Dissonance is a allusion to what's called cognitive dissonance, which has become a very popular term showing up now in popular culture. And unfortunately, it's become so distorted that in a way that always happens to things that become excessively popular and are being used by some people as accusations against other people and so on. Denialism, again, refers to another phenomenon. There's a lot of it going on about the extent of American and Israeli terrorism, torture, and we're acquainted with classical versions of it with respect to Darwinism, to Holocaust denial, and to what we might call global warming or climate change, if you prefer that terminology. It's another triumph of propaganda to get us to change the name of it. But I'm not interested in these things from the standpoint of their subjective effects, but they're from the side of their social and political effects. And what we've been hearing a lot of this past week was the dissonance and denialism concerning the Senate report on torture by the CIA and American operatives abroad. So the dissonance in the part of the public is we don't do such things, and even if we did, it was completely justified. Former Vice President Cheney has said very explicitly that he would do it again in a minute because it was all needed and justified, and it saved American lives and provided us with intelligence information that could not have been obtained otherwise, and maybe there was a ticking time bomb, and on and on. And of course, denialism is the other aspect of this, where people just are unable to accept that certain things have been done in their name and with their approval, and so they will find some way of rationalizing around it and of distorting the whole case and make it fit within their own personal parameters of reasoning, self-justification, and so on. There's an interesting book on these topics, by the way, that I read some time ago. Mistakes were made by Carol Tavris and Ellen Aronson. Mistakes were made, but not by me. Why we justify foolish beliefs, bad decisions, and hurtful acts, 2007, and I recommend it to you. It's very well written and gives you some insight into the usual patterns of self-justification and rationalization that are used by a whole lot of people. Interesting insights, for example, of the kind, why do we feel compelled to criticize and traduce some people, to slander them? It's often because we've wronged them first. And the psychological mechanism there seems to be that we're trying to show to ourselves and to the world that they really weren't worth any more than the kind of treatment that we gave them, so on. Another one is if you want to do people to like you, you don't do things for them, you get them to do things for you. And then the justification will work that, well, you must be a good and worthy person if they did that thing for you. So it's remarkable the way this reacts back upon our own behavior and thinking. Interesting experiments reported there. Fraternity recruits, the more rigorous, shall we say, and intense the initiation is typically, the more committed the fraternity members are to that group. This has long been known by religious groups, for example, that if you raise the barriers to entrance high enough and make people suffer enough in order to become a member, they will become far more committed to it than if it's too easy to become a member. And we've seen this again and again. They talk about high sacrifice religious groups, for example. It was very common 15 or 20 years ago. But that's getting off onto another tangent, and it's a theme that we will need to refer to and come back to, I think, from time to time in the future. There's been a lot of investigation recently about the patterns of justification that are very common now, these inherent biases, apparently, of the human mind, and our need to justify ourselves, not only to others, but to ourselves, and to claim that whatever we did was good and right, or at least absolutely inevitable, or natural, or otherwise worthy, and be unable to tolerate other kinds of views. So this creates a number of dilemmas for us, problems. Here's an article from the end of October in the local newspaper. Court filing, FBI used ruse to get warrant. This is about a case of entrapment by the FBI, the American Secret Police, of police entering by a secret kind of means, a ruse, a casino in Las Vegas, I believe it was, in order to trap some people who were engaging in sports betting, for example, that they weren't able to get an indictment of otherwise. And it's a continuing problem in the law. Again and again, naive young people have been tricked, deceived into doing things that were apparently illegal by secret government agents, provocateurs, who tried to induce them and persuade them and talk them into doing those things. And it's always been a problem in the courts, but again and again, the courts have held that even if someone tricks you into doing something that's illegal, you're the one who's still to be punished for it, and not the police who or others who deceived you into doing it. The other points I wanted to make, and this I'm afraid will become incoherent if I try to cover too many of these. The passage of the budget bill last week by the Senate, 101 was $1 trillion, and this again was actually written by Citigroup lobbyists, one of the mega banks, this bill, but a lot of people seem to have trouble assimilating that. And if the Citigroup lobbyists did this, well, it must be because they do the most about it, and it was if not a good thing, at least a tolerable thing, and we will have to shrug it off because we don't know what to do about it. Two minor positive points. The Justice Department will not prosecute James Risen, the author of Pay Any Price, and an earlier book exposing some of the tactics of the police, secret police, or the CIA, apparently. But they will proceed against Jeffrey Sterling for leaking some CIA material to Risen. Of course, these officials do a lot of leaking themselves when they find it advantageous to do so, but we're not supposed to credit that very much. Dr. Vivek Murthy was confirmed as Surgeon General because he had held that gun violence is a public issue, and this set the gun lobby against him. The NRA was, shall we say, up in arms about that, and he got confirmed finally anyway, so that looks like one positive sign. The thing I want to come back to eventually is what happened here in this room last night with the Urbana City Council and the problem of what's called the militarization of the police concerning such equipment as tasers and armored trucks and other kinds of heavy military equipment. So I'll stop there for now.
Thank you, Ron. You remember, as I do, the late Senator Everett Dirksen, who is famous for having remarked, "A billion here, a billion there. Before long, you're talking real money."
Yeah,
right?
pretty soon it adds up to real money. Right?
And this week, we're talking about $1 trillion here and $1 trillion there. And people are concerned that this average is adding up to real money. That is, the spending bill that the Congress just passed is $1 trillion. And it was also discussed this week that the bill for the war in Afghanistan has now reached $1 trillion. These are amazing figures, and of course those people, particularly on the political right, who say that, well, the U.S. is going bankrupt, the U.S. can't pay for this and so forth, you know, that's not quite true. Unfortunately, people don't turn down checks from the federal government, and the way they turn down maybe my check or Ron's check, and therefore the question is not quite so acute for the United States, but going broke. The question about what the money is being spent on should indeed be discussed, and there are indications that more and more Americans are concerned about that and concerned about the money the U.S. is spending to kill people particularly, and also is spending that in a way that goes into the pockets of the very richest people in the society. All the income gains from since the economic crisis of a few years ago seem to have accrued to the 1%, the very richest people in the country. And there is enough unrest about that that our masters in Washington are actually, I think, quite worried about it. You're watching Aware on the Air, a program presented by the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, and our concern is primarily war, but the war that the United States is carrying on and has been carrying on for more than a generation in the Middle East is connected with the other things in which these trillions of dollars are being spent. And it's those connections that we find it important to talk about because the government doesn't want to talk about them. The government doesn't want to talk about the sorts of things that it is doing that result in the accelerating increase in inequality in this country, the rich garnering more and more, and the majority becoming progressively immiserated, becoming poorer and poorer. It is bound up with the foreign policy, and the foreign policy of the United States is very much designed to make sure that those profits of the very rich remain in place. This has been the conscious policy of American governments since the Second World War, when the U.S. is the only undamaged country to emerge from the war, was effectively in charge of the world economy. And the efforts of successive American administrations have been to keep it that way. This week, we hear particularly about the question of war in regard to terror. Terror is the buzzword that has been used particularly in the last decade, to talk about the sorts of wars that the United States is involved in. We're fighting terror, of course. Now, it's been pointed out that the word is difficult. If you go into the documents of the American government, everything from Army field manuals to congressional enactments, and try to look for a definition of terror, it is impossible to construct a definition that doesn't include what the United States is doing around the world. There's only one way to construct a definition that does that, and that's to say that terror is what they do, while it's not what we do. And only by putting a name on it in that fashion do we find a way to talk about terror as not applying to the United States. That is, we can do it only by definition. But there are two incidents this week specifically involved with terror that raise some real questions about what the situation that the United States finds itself in today actually is. A terror incident in Sydney, Australia, and a terror incident in northern Pakistan. Taliban gunners unleashed their deadliest attack in recent years yesterday in northern Pakistan, storming a military-run school and killing at least 126 people. The last number I heard actually was more than 140 people, most of them teenagers. A spokesman for the Pakistani Taliban, which are fighting to overthrow the government and create a strict Islamic state, claimed responsibility for the attack in a phone call to the media. He said it was in retaliation for the military's, the Pakistani Army's, offensive against the militants. Drone operations by the Pakistani military and the United States in the tribal areas of northwestern Pakistan have long spurred deadly retaliation from the Taliban, known as the Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan, or the TTP, which is based in the region. Now, it's important to see that what's going on here in this horrible event, this event an attack on a military school which cost the lives of more apparently than 140 children, young teenagers, that this event is part of a pattern, is part of a war that the United States is conducting. That is, the criminals who carried out this attack did it as a response to attacks on them coming largely from the United States, coming from the President of the United States, who chooses from directions given him by John Brennan, the head of the CIA, those who are to be hit with drone strikes on every Tuesday, what the White House aides call Terror Tuesday. Obama is in fact terrorizing innocent Pakistanis, as well as the Pakistani Taliban, on an almost daily basis. The drones hit Pakistan on a schedule like that. The drone war that's being waged isn't precise, it isn't surgical, as the administration says. It kills hundreds of innocents, including children. And for thousands of more innocents who live in the targeted communities, the drone war makes their lives into a nightmare worthy of dystopian novels. People are always afraid. Women cower in their homes. Children are kept out of school. The stress they endure gives them psychiatric disorders. Men are driven crazy by an inability to sleep as drones buzz overhead 24 hours a day, a deadly strike possible at any moment. At worst, this policy creates more terrorists than it kills. At best, America is ruining the lives of thousands of innocent people and killing hundreds of innocents for a small increase in safety from terrorists, and is promoting retaliation of the sort that occurred this week. It is cowardly, immoral, and illegal. It's a policy deliberately cloaked in opportunistic secrecy. The Obama administration says the drone program is secret, and therefore it doesn't even tell us what drone strikes have accomplished. We are reliant on international groups that gather this information and make it available to us. This last week, a friend of this program, Kathy Kelly of Voices for Creative Nonviolence in Chicago, was sentenced to 3 months in prison. It was sentence, according to the judge, was to rehabilitate Ms. Kelly. The rehabilitation was necessary, said the judge, because Ms. Kelly had taken a loaf of bread and a petition onto an Air Force base from which these drones are flown, and in order to present them to the commander of that base. Now, who's the criminal here? The woman who is, after many trips to the Middle East, tried to make us aware of what the American policy actually is in the region, or the people who are killing men, women, and children at great rates in the region with drones sent from the United States, from Air Force bases in the Midwest, from American installations that are supposedly guarding us from terror, but in fact are killing people practically indiscriminately throughout the region and promoting attacks like the one in a military school in Pakistan this week. This is a shameful program. Most Americans don't know that Obama's drone program, and it's clear that it's his, they've boasted about it in that sense, Obama's drone program has killed perhaps 5,000 people, at least as many children as were killed in the attack in Pakistan today, and probably twice that number, and it continues, it's ongoing. We listened this week to the head of the CIA, John Brennan, trying to justify the torture regime of the previous administration. And the Obama administration is working very hard to try to convince us that the questions about torture have to do with the Bush administration. That's simply not true. And in fact, the torture in the nature of the drone program continues, and it is, according to what we know about this secret program, more victims were chosen by the president today for attacks with drones. This is a shameful program that Americans need to be aware of, and the American government needs to stop. You're watching Aware on the Air. We try to talk about what is not being talked about in the American media, about what the government that we're responsible for is doing. Comments,
Yes.
Ron?
Yes. I think we should recognize that in view of our infatuation with drones and other extremely high-tech weapons, we should realize that eventually everyone will get them. And the rationale, the precedent has already been set by the USA for using all of these things. So it's only a matter of time before Iran, for example, has drones. They've already made some claims and some progress in that respect. They have the capacity, according to some, to get atomic weapons and so on. We know that Russia already has these things. But when we talk about American power and global power and so on, why America is not in decline, this is always the thing that comes up and is displayed most prominently, is the superiority of American weapons. We are the global superpower, the only one left. It's a unipolar world, and we tend to regard it as impossible for other nations to match us in this respect. Well, this is true of every scientific and technical and engineering advance. Eventually the others will catch up. China is already arming with drones, and it's only a matter of time before they have them capable of hitting the USA, as well as a number of other countries. So I think we should not try to take too much comfort and pride in that. It's, again, only a matter of time. We are, as Carl mentioned, I think, creating more terrorists every day by our attacks on people in the Middle East. And always our rationale, of course, the excuse is that we are dealing with terrorists, but again, we're hoping that people will not think of what we did to Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the firebombing of Tokyo, which was even more horrendous, and killing thousands of civilians and hundreds of thousands of civilians in those countries. And yet, the denialism is so strong that we tend not to want to call that as terrorism. It's another matter of denialism. We didn't do it, and besides, even if we did, it was completely justified in the circumstances. Well, they can use that rationale also and begin claiming that they're saving ISIS lives, or they're getting intelligence about possible ticking time bombs in that way that they could not possibly get otherwise. And so that can be their justification too. And I think we can guess where that will lead. I want to return to the theme of the militarization of American society in particular, and of local police forces in particular. Excuse me. The idea is that the more resources we put into these adventures abroad, the fewer we will have for carrying out needed measures at home, such as increasing the ability of the infrastructure to deal with American society's needs, to fund education, and the like. But it's coming back to us in a more obvious way now under the aegis of what's called the militarization of the police. The police in this country are looking, according to many, and to me, more and more like an occupying army. And I think we should be concerned about this. There's a local group that is trying to resist this. We've seen some of the effects of it elsewhere in Ferguson, Missouri, and Staten Island, New York City, and a number of other places where the police now view themselves as the last line of, or the first line of defense sometimes, against these criminals who are trying to do terrible things, and in some cases trying to entice them into doing bad things. But anyway, last night, as I said in this room, there were a number of people at the Urbana City Council meeting who raised this question about how far can we reasonably go in this direction of arming the police with heavy-duty military weapons and tempting them to go in the direction of more and more killing and injuring of ordinary citizens. Last night we heard statements from a number of people, some of whom are members of AWARE and are well known to us. Stuart Levy, Karen Medina, Gerald Cruz, Belden Fields, and Brian Dolinar, among a number of others. And they gave us a statement endorsed by the Champaign County Citizens for Peace and Justice, I believe, and a number of other organizations that I think are saying important and necessary things. And I want to tip my hat to them. The Champaign County NAACP, the North End Men's Breakfast Club, the Champaign-Urbana Citizens for Peace and Justice, the Ministerial Alliance, the Champaign County ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, Champaign-Urbana Immigration Forum, the GEO Solidarity Committee, AWARE, that's us, Central Illinois Jobs with Justice, the Central Illinois Chapter of Progressive Democrats, the Channing Murray Foundation, the First Mennonite Church of Urbana-Champaign, the New Covenant Church, the Social Action Committee of the Unitarian Universalist Church of Urbana-Champaign, Students for Justice in Palestine, the Urbana-Champaign Friends Meeting, the UIUC chapter of Amnesty International, the School for Designing a Society, and the University YMCA. All these people signed on to this, and I think they really need to be taken seriously. What are we becoming? What are we turning into? And do we need the police to be equipped and disciplined as military units in order to deal with the problems of crime and unrest in our communities? I don't see that we're anywhere near that, and it would indicate to me a complete social breakdown if that should turn out to be the case. So again, I want to acknowledge the efforts of those people and to trying to head this off and prevent the USA to becoming just another warrior society like Sparta or whatever. I hope we can avoid that fate. So again, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ron. The demonstrations across the country that occurred over this last weekend were quite massive, from the East Coast to the West Coast and many large cities in between. People were out demonstrating, often with the themes that have come from these police murders: I can't breathe, hands up, don't shoot, so forth and so on. This worries our masters in Washington. It's becoming increasingly obvious that policing in this country and the war of terror that we are carrying out around the world are bound up together. And that the police murders that have shocked the entire nation recently have to be dealt with by the population as a whole, and have to be dealt with politically. The police have got to be curbed. And the only instrument we have to do that are the political jurisdictions in which the police ostensibly work. That is, your local city council, your state government, even the county control of the sheriff's department. These are the areas in which the police are going to have to be dissuaded from taking on this anti-terrorist approach that's all too common, apparently, in American police departments. Across America, the cops seem to think of themselves as Ron said, as an occupying army, beset by terrorists, even if the terrorists are 12-year-olds with toy guns, and therefore licensed to kill, allowed to shoot to kill these terrorists. This has got to stop, and it is impossible, I think, to suggest that it's unconnected with the war that the United States has brought to the rest of the world for its own economic purposes. This is serious, and it's necessary for us to do something about it on our local level, and indeed to curb the country that we are responsible for from carrying out war around the world as it is. Only very few American politicians are even talking about the issue. The retired Representative Ron Paul said this week that, look, as he has been saying for some time, the CIA has to be abolished. The NSA has to be abolished. The American troops in 1,000 overseas bases have to be brought home. The U.S. has to cease carrying on war around the world, and now we've seen all the more recently, it has to cease carrying on war against its own citizens at home. This is a major political project, and it can't wait. It's what we have to do. You're watching Aware on the Air. We talk about some of these problems particularly. It's recently been said that there are two major issues that threaten the very survival of the human race. And those are, as Ron mentioned earlier, climate catastrophe and nuclear war. We think, perhaps under the influence of the denialism Ron was speaking of, we think that these are such frightening possibilities that they can't quite be real. Most Americans are at least partially receptive to the notion that there's something overstated about global warming. After all, it's cold outside, isn't it? The denialism extends perhaps even further to nuclear war. Most Americans think the arguments about nuclear war have to do with the existence of the Soviet Union a generation and more ago, and it's not a problem today. Not a problem today. Diana Johnstone, who writes for the publication counterpunch.org, has an important consideration of that in that publication this week. She writes, "The danger of outright war between the two nuclear powers, U.S. and Russia, is actually much greater than it was during the Cold War. We're now in a sort of frozen war because nothing the Russians say or do can have any effect on American policy. The Obama administration has invented a totally fictional story about Russian aggression, which the mass media and now the Congress have accepted and endorsed. Russian leaders have responded with honesty, truth, and common sense, remaining calm despite the invective thrown at them, It has done no good whatsoever. The positions are frozen. When reason fails, force follows sooner or later, close quote. That's Diana Johnstone. I hope she's incorrect, certainly for that last line, but the analysis seems to me quite correct, and I must admit, for years of doing a program like this and talking about American politics and the propaganda that always surrounds what the American government does, the real strength of the American government perhaps since the First World War, has been to convince people that it's doing something other than what it is actually doing. It's managed to do that in a way that has been commented on as producing the most effective propaganda regime in history. But still in all, most Americans don't realize how the story of present American relations with Russia has been propagandized into this notion of a mad Russian leader threatening allies and associates of the United States in Europe. Now, this is pretty close to an inversion of what the actual situation is. President Obama has signed today a new bill placing further sanctions on the Russian economy, and the American sanctions on the Russian economy are having an obvious effect. The ruble, the Russian currency, has fallen in relation to the dollar quite sharply, and the price of oil, which is central to the Russian budget, is almost half of what it was 6 months ago. This is not an accident. This is what the United States is doing in its machinations in regard to moving Russia into the position of a third world country, no longer able to counter the U.S. control of the Eurasian economy, which we have essentially held since the Second World War and continue to hold in conjunction with NATO, the so-called North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the group that's to stop Russia from invading the North Atlantic countries. This is always a nonsense. It remains a nonsense today, but it also is an organizing principle for the U.S. to try to control the economic affairs of Western Europe and indeed of Russia and China. Now, the fact that for the first time since the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia is countering American economic activities around the world in terms of an alliance with China and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which brings together a number of other Eurasian countries in an attempt, in fact, to resist American economic imperialism on in the area, that this has led to this propaganda fest on the part of the Obama administration as it moves to increase its influence in Eurasia, and it's not adverse to killing people to do it. The government which the U.S. sponsored in Kiev in Ukraine has killed as many people in the eastern part of Ukraine as Israel killed in Gaza last summer. This American aggression, and it's nothing less than that, threatens the possibility of war in Europe for perhaps the first time since the Second World War. And people stand aghast at the fact that the Obama administration, in pressing these policies, is willing to take this incredible risk, a risk indeed of nuclear war, and a risk of war in Europe in a way that most Americans would have thought impossible if they thought about it at all. But the situation is just that bad, and indeed we should be concerned about it.
Yes, interesting article I read on Newsmax this morning. It's usually, well, more of a right-wing thing, but there's another one from Stratfor by George Friedman, who was in Russia on December 9th and talking to a number of people there. And he says the story that we're getting here from the corporate media is very badly distorted. that the Russians remember that they were invaded twice from the West by Napoleon and by Hitler. And they have developed the position that they will not allow a hostile power on their border. And at the same time, I've seen pictures posted online now of armored personnel carriers and other armored vehicles going by train across the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, right up to the borders of Russia. And Russia has made it clear for decades now, for generations perhaps, that they will not tolerate that. It's happened to them too often. They lost, variously estimated, between 20 and 26 million people in World War II. The war between Russia and Germany, the Soviet Union and Germany, in 1941 to 45, was, according to a number of historians that I've read now, the most vicious and fatal war in the history of the world. It was so brutal that it's just hard to imagine what it did. And again, Russia and Putin are being adamant about not allowing to happen again. And I wonder if we're aware of the extent to which it could have happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, but USA is very sensitive about having anything resembling foreign arms on its borders. We couldn't allow, for example, there to be Russian missiles within 90 miles of Florida in Cuba. So yet we think that the Russians should not object too strongly to having massive American armaments right on their borders and ready to roll into the Soviet Union. And how can we do that? Well, it's, of course, of the essence of political thinking not to apply it equitably. It all turns out to be a matter of who's doing it to whom. And the central political question always, of course, being, according to some, who kills whom? Who thinkers are always at the bottom of all of this political calculation. So the idea being it's okay or excusable for us to do it, but not for you. And we are justified in condemning and, if necessary, killing you for doing what we claim to be able to do ourselves and do with impunity. So that's the way it's always gone, I guess. And again, it's just purely a matter of whose ox is being gored, and I don't accept that. But if there are any kinds of norms, rules, principles available for dealing with these things, then they have to be applied equitably across a large number of people, and ways to rationalize one's way out of that, to me, seem to be kind of contemptible. But anyway, it's, again, a big theme, and I'm not sure I can be very coherent about it right now.
The task is to say clearly what's going on, to see clearly what's going on, and to talk about it, and to see if this is indeed what we want to be complicit with, what we want the government for which we're responsible to do. The psychologists talk about a mechanism called projection. And this is a personal psychological twist or turn whereby one ascribes to another person, one's opponent or one's enemy particularly, things that in fact describe one's own behavior. For example, a rude person may say, "People are always being rude to me," You know, and the rudeness, which is an aspect of their personality, becomes a condition of the social world in which they have to make their way. I think something like that works on the political level as well, and works on the group as well as the individual level. And I had a very interesting example of that just recently in talking to a political science class at the University of Illinois. The class was run by the ex-representative to Congress from this area, Tim Johnson, who was Republican congressman from this district for many years. Tim Johnson was teaching this class, and he invited a number of local people in to talk to his class, one of whom was the current representative from this region, Rodney Davis. Congressman Davis represents this district in the House of Representatives. In an hour's talk, I sat through Congressman Davis' talk too, although he didn't sit through mine. In an hour's talk to this class, Congressman Davis made precisely one comment about foreign policy, about the sort of issues we've been talking about tonight. And his one comment about foreign policy was as follows: Vladimir Putin brings the Cold War mentality back. That's the only thing we heard about any of these issues from the congressman. But what we had here, it seems to me, is an example of this sort of projection. The Cold War mentality, indeed the frozen war, as Diana Johnstone was calling it, the Cold War mentality is coming from Washington, and it's producing the economic upset in Russia right now because of the aggressive moves that this administration and previous administrations have made in Eastern Europe. Rodney Davis was not making this up, by the way. He was simply quoting the president. He didn't know it, I don't think, but he was quoting. I mean, it's not the way it works. You know, it's part of the air you breathe rather than specific lists of quotations when you want to talk about politics at the level at which he does it. He was quoting Barack Obama, who said in August, talking to a late-night talk show host, that the Russians often, said Barack Obama, slip back into Cold War thinking. Well, that's very interesting from a president who has done more to renew the Cold War in relationship to Russia, the conflict between the United States and Russia, than any president, certainly since Bill Clinton. But look, the view here is common to both parties. We're not talking about a partisan view, or it's at least common to the center of both parties, the Republicans and Democrats, across the country. There are objections from the right wing of the Republican Party, if you like, and the left wing of the Democratic Party, in other words, outside that central consensus of the parties, coming from people like Dennis Kucinich among the Democrats, and Patrick Buchanan among the Republicans, both of whom in the last couple of weeks have decried this American attempt to promote hostilities with Russia. That's where the objections are coming from. It's not coming from, you know, left or right as we normally talk about it in American politics. It's coming from the fringes outside the conjunction or the agreement of the two main parties. This is what we've got to continue to talk about. We've got to get this discussion back into what's going on, because the standard political spokesmen from both parties are promoting this war. There was a resolution passed by the House of Representatives that has to be read to be believed. I mean, if I were to tell you that this came from the height of the Red Scare after the Second World War, you would believe it if you actually read the document. I don't believe many of the congressmen who voted for it read it. That's often the way it is, but there were only 10 members of the House of Representatives who voted against this resolution, which is effectively a declaration of war against Russia. It's astonishing that this happens, that it goes without comment, and it takes only people, or it's only people on the fringes of the American political establishment who point out what the main line of that American political establishment is doing, and it's doing nothing short of risking war. This is a very serious matter indeed, and one that unfortunately, I'm afraid we're going to have to be talking about more in the new year, because the Obama administration shows no sign of changing its belligerent posture. And even if we survive into a new administration, what we will get, more than likely, will be an administration with the same dangerous, the same criminal tendencies in regard to international affairs.
Interesting aspect of this to me is the reemergence of the supposed Cold War tension and hostility between the USA and Russia. Always in the past, during the official, shall we say, Cold War, it was thought to be because of Russia's communism. They were a totalitarian nation, and it was their communist ideology that we had to fight and to defend ourselves against, and so on. But the whole competition is emerging again, the hostility, the possibility of military action, and so on, when communism is no longer an issue, which will tend to show that it never was really much of an issue. It was the competition of the USA with Russia and perhaps other powers, eventually China, that's really at the root of it. And global power and dominance is really the issue. It was never communism as such, although we were constantly fed this line about the ideological repugnance of Soviet totalitarianism and so on. And it looks to me as if that was never really the root of the problem, the ultimate issue. So I've become very disillusioned about that whole way of painting the picture of the competition between the former Soviet Union, present-day Russia, and the USA.
Our discussion tonight has been so full of gloom and potential doom that I'd like to end with actually in a hopeful note, a sort of an inverse hopeful note, because it grows out of the events in Sydney, Australia in the last couple of days, in which a madman took control of a cafe and ended up with a shooting by police that killed several people, including the hostage taker himself. The hostage taker was Iranian, and there was an immense outpouring of anti-Muslim and anti-Arab, strangely enough, he was Iranian, material in the Australian press, but it also had a movement which I had not heard of before, called I'll Ride With You, on Twitter and Facebook and whatnot in Australia, in which other Australians volunteer to ride on public transportation with Muslims and Arabs who are being subjected to harassment by yahoos in the Australian political scene. A slight indication of maybe some good things that are happening. You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, in the 51st week of 2014. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett for Urbana Public Television. Thanks to him also, this program and others like it will be available on YouTube, and see our Facebook page for Aware with materials relating to the show. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others who are being persecuted by the Obama administration. Now, this is Carl Esterbrook for Ron Zoke and other members and friends of Aware, saying, in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.